All right. So based off of kind of some of the responses, so I have an idea for today. So we'll allow us to kind of you guys to work on it a little bit and then kind of me to cover some stuff. And it looked like the thing that people wanted to cover the most was elasticity, a pretty large margin. So we'll kind of start there. Probably kind of work into some government action stuff. That was kind of the next most likely thing. We won't be able to cover every single problem here today. I might ask if there's any specific problems that people want to see me work through after kind of the first half of the class. But to start out, hopefully, you're here today because you want to start the exam. I'm not using my paper, so I guess don't want to be there, I guess, but I think this is a valuable kind of thing. We're going to go through this review. Generally, I keep track of who shows up and try to see if there's a correlation in performance. Not really good amount of people here today, so I'm liking that already. So let's kind of start out with this example. We're kind of thinking about the starting price. Let's say the price starts out at 20. And then it's going to increase. Actually, no, we'll do a decrease to 10. So we've got this price decrease. And initially, of our old quantity or our starting quantity here, let's say that was 40 units. And then after that price decrease, what should be true about the new quantity? It should be price goes down, quantity demanded should go up, right? Cheaper things are, people buy more. So let's do. I'll do 50. Try to keep these numbers solid. So the first question I want you to think about is how would you calculate the elasticity of demand? So we said that when we've got this change in price and change in our quantity, it's not just a change, we want percentage change. We'll kind of give you our elasticity measure. And we're always thinking about here, I'm looking at the price elasticity of demand. I could think about it more generally. Whatever's in my numerator is whatever I'm trying to measure the responsiveness of to whatever's in my denominator, which is whatever's changing. So we can do income elasticities. I think the problem on the practice problems is actually income elasticity that you have to calculate using this midpoint method. And just as kind of a reminder, I'll kind of give you some time to work on this, kind of working through how we set this up. We'll take whatever the change is in quantity and then divide it by the average of those two quantity values. So how do I find the average of two numbers? I simply add them up, divide by 2. And then I'm going to divide that by the change in price divided by my average price. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to answer these questions. So the first one is going to be, I want you to have a little bit of time to work through, try to plug these values in, try to come up with what the elasticity of demand is. Okay. Then I want you to answer, is it inelastic or is it elastic or is it unelastic? I'm kind of abbreviating that with just what type of elasticity we have. Is it inelastic, elastic, or unelastic? And then from there, given that price decrease and given what you compute the elasticity to be, what direction should total revenue be moving because of that price change or because of that price decrease? Okay. Excuse me. So I'll give you guys a little bit of time, maybe like 3-4 minutes. Talk to the people around you. Try to work on these together. Like, you know, working with other people is like the best way to actually learn things. I always like telling students coming in, if you can get a good cohort of individuals that are in the same class with, and you work on stuff. A lot of times you know something that they know something you don't. So talk to people around you, work on these, try to come up with the answer to these 3 questions, and then we'll spend a little bit of time kind of reviewing and talking about them together. Okay? And if you can't read my writing, I have a question. Raise your hand. I can try to point it out.
We're working on number one.
Yep, start with one, then you can kind of go to two. Once you have one, you can answer two. Once you have two, you should be able to answer problem three. Yep.
On the bottom, it's P2 plus P1 divided by 2 of the,
Yes.
okay. that's-
Yeah, so you're thinking about, if an easier way to think about that is, if it's easier, instead of adding them up divided by two, you're just finding the average. So the average of those two numbers, add them up divided by two. Yep. No, I get that it's probably especially for you hard to see over there. So if you ever have questions, let me know.
Yeah. sometimes
It gets in the way.
I would.
Yeah, sure.
No.
So when we divide them, like the percent change of them,
Mhm.
we keep in decimal form or?
As long as you keep them the same, it's fine. If they're both in decimal form, it's okay. If they're both in percentage form, basically the units cancel out, right? I divide, so it doesn't matter if I. Yep, and I'll mention that
Here.
once I go up here because of something else, but yes,
And then I round up the
conventional rounding. So if it's,
0.2222, 0.23.
yeah, and like on the exam here, let me see if I got one here. Like, notice for this one, it only goes out to one decimal. I think that there's, if I had, example where I asked you for the SSE, if it's out to 3 decimals in the answers, then that's what you would round into.
Okay. Why do I?
All right. So
You give me a say.
we'll start working together here. Now, one thing you could do is break this down into parts. In fact, I'd probably suggest it. So I don't know if anybody did that, but if I try to find my percent change in coin demanded first, so that would be doing what? 50 minus 40 divided by 50 plus 40 over 2 is gonna be what? 10 over 45. Anybody want to help me out with the math on that one? What? 9, so point what? 222 repeated. Now, as you're working through the intermediate, you want to break this down into parts. If I give you the answers, I'm never going to go anywhere past 3 decimals. So you can kind of think about your intermediate values. Feel free to round to the third decimal. And maybe that puts you off by 1. And instead of keeping the answer out to wherever your calculator is stored at. But I'm never going to give you answers that would be just that 1 decimal point off. Right. So even if you're like off of the third decimal, you're going to be able to identify kind of what the correct answer is. Now, here I don't have an example where we're doing that. We're kind of looking through this one I created, but that'll be kind of practice. So I think it's probably easier to kind of break this down to parts now. If I then do this for the price, I come up with what? Yeah, so this is what? Negative 10 over 15. So negative 0.66 repeated. So I can kind of think about this as negative 0.666. So I should get negative 1/3 or negative 0.33 repeated. Right? Sorry, my 3s are hard to write. So
Can you move the projector over a little bit?
any questions about calculating this? Yeah.
How do you get 0.222 and then 0.666?
So if I take quantities, and I find the change in my quantities. I then divide it by the average, right? Adding these up. 40 plus 50 and dividing by 2. I should get what? Negative 10 over 45, which is that 0.22 repeated.
Negative 10 over 45.
10 over 45, right? What was the change in quantity? The quantity went from 40 to 50, right? So the change in quantity was 10. What's the average? I'm using pretty easy values here. What's the average of 40 and 50? 45. So 10 over 45 should give you that 0.22 repeated. Same kind of idea here. I don't want to get lost in this too much. I'm taking the change in quantity divided by the average. Now I'm just writing out all in one equation how you find that. You can break this up into parts. What was the change in price? Negative 10 divided by the average price, 15. So that's how I came up with that negative 0.66, right? Negative 10 over 15. You can plug all this in your calculator once, just becomes harder with the parentheses. I think it's easier to break it down.
My question is, I know you said you're gonna give us the equations. Are you gonna give us like the first part of the equation, and are we supposed to remember that?
So the equations that I'll give you on this exam, I'll write up on the board your elasticity equation, just like I have here. I won't write out every single elasticity, because part of understanding these elasticities is if I tell you on the income elasticity that of demand, that means you're looking for the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in income. Right? Now, it would change a little bit here, right? Instead of being quantity and price, it'd be quantity and income. I'm just going to give you kind of the general way in which you calculate these percent changes. But you might have to apply it to not the elasticity of demand, but maybe to the elasticity of income. So that question that asks you to calculate that up here might be a good one to know how to do. Okay. Any other questions? So my elasticity of demand is negative 0.33. Did anybody get then this next question? What would I consider demand? Elastic, inelastic, or unit elastic?
It's just when you make it like the absolute value.
Yeah, right. To make it easier, right? All elasticities, we're just going to think about the absolute value in order to determine what their elasticity is, what range they're in. Because if we start doing negative values, we start talking about being less than, but negative values are larger. So really all we're looking for here is if our elasticity measure is greater than 1, equal to 1, or less than 1. The lowest our elasticity could ever be, technically, is 0, which would represent what? Remember, this is a measure of responsiveness. So if the price is changing, and I'm getting that the responsiveness of demand is 0, I would say that demand is perfectly, the price changed. People didn't change how much they're buying, so we would say they're perfectly inelastic. So that might be a good way to remember. When I see that elasticity, the absolute value would be between 0 and 1. This is when it's inelastic, right? Because a responsiveness of 0 means I'm not responding. I am not elastic at all. I'm completely and perfectly inelastic. Might be a good way to remember that range. Not going to give you these ranges on the exam. Right? This is something you have to know. This is an equation. Okay? If it's equal to 1, we said it's unit elastic, which means that if it's greater than 1, must be when we see that it's elastic, right? That people are really responsive. So here we had what type of demand? It was negative 0.33. Take the absolute value, 0.333. So within that range of 0 to 1, we say that it's inelastic. Okay. Does anybody get to question 3? Some people work on a little bit. So a good way to remember 3, I think, is to draw out the graphs, right? So on a lot of these problems, when it comes to supply and demand shifts, anything where you can draw a graph and have a visualization as you work on the problem will be very helpful. This is a good example of that. Okay. So after this price change, did total revenue go up or down? So this is what you want to remember when it comes to total revenue elasticity. if I'm looking at my demand curve, we always start out with the upper portion being elastic, the lower portion being inelastic. Now we can walk through the reasonings behind why. You don't necessarily have to kind of reproduce that on the exam, but think about here, if price is high, well then even if I see pretty large changes, it's going to be a small percent. And then if quantity is low, even small increases would be a very large percent. So small price changes, large quantity responses, we would have very elastic demand up there. And then kind of as we move further down, demand becomes more inelastic. Now, I'm drawing this probably out of scale. The unit elastic point is probably a very narrow range, but it's somewhere in the middle, right? I'm just kind of drawing it to be a little larger just to make the point. You should then, you draw out that demand curve, and remember, it starts out elastic, becomes more and more inelastic. The way that total revenue moves, and we walk through the reasonings behind why, it's going to look something like this, right? So I put price here, sorry. If I'm graphing out total revenue, right, which we said total revenue is just the two things that we have graphed on demand, price and quantity, right? So as I lower the price, that's going to decrease total revenue. But if people are really responsive, yeah, I might take a little bit of hit, but I'm not selling my goods for as much, but I'm selling way more, right? So it overcompensates that. So when it's elastic, when I decrease that price, I'm increasing my total revenue. When I get to that unit elastic point, kind of total revenue is there, kind of plateaued. And then if I continue to decrease the price past that point, I would then just be decreasing my total revenue. So what type of elasticity of demand do we have here? We said it was inelastic. So even if you wanted to, you could kind of help yourself out thinking about, okay, I was between 2 points here. The price of 20, price of 10, and then we had the corresponding quantities. Just to draw it to give us a nice visual. Right? We decreased the price. So that was going to push us to be down the demand curve, right? So we were decreasing price, increasing quantity. So if I think about where I was at on my total revenue curve, that decrease in price would actually lower my revenues. So say that again, right? We saw this price decrease. We calculated the elasticity and found that we were on the inelastic portion of our demand curve. That's why I knew I could draw the prices on my inelastic portion of the demand curve here. That price decrease, if I'm on the inelastic portion, notice price decreases will push quantity up. Quantity getting pushed up here would then push my total revenue down. So if I was on this portion of the demand curve, what should I do to raise revenues? If decreasing the price decreased my total revenues, then to increase total revenue, I'd want to increase the price if I was on the inelastic portion of the demand curve. And then everything would be exactly the opposite if I calculated the elasticity and determined that it was in fact elastic, right? And if I'm on the elastic portion, then by decreasing the price, I'd actually be increasing total revenues. So being able to kind of draw this, stack these graphs would be really helpful when it comes to thinking about that. Now, I doubt I'm gonna like I'm wrapping all these into one question here. And on the exam, it's gonna be something more like, you see a price decrease from 20 to 10, you calculate the elasticity, it's 0.33. What happens to total revenue? Right, so I'm like giving you these things. It's not like they're all stacked. It's not like if you got the first question wrong, you then automatically are going to get the second question wrong and vice versa, right? So every question you're probably going to start out being given new information. But just since we're working on these together, kind of keeping it all consistent. Okay. Any questions? All right, so a little bit more time to work on this. So we've got some more information and ask you a couple more questions, let you guys work on it, and then we'll kind of come together and talk about it. Hopefully this is helpful. So we just found that the elasticity of demand was negative 0.3 grain. Let's say from that same percentage change in price, which is, if I can remember right, 0.66 repeated. We see that the change in quantity supplied, the percent change in quantity supplied was 0.55. Give me a little bit tougher numbers than I probably would on the exam. So the first thing is, let's figure out what is the elasticity of supply. Then determine, is it elastic, inelastic, or unit elastic? And then that third thing that I want you to do is, if the government imposed a tax, who bears more of the burden? So this one probably not quite as long, but I was to give you these percent changes in price, and maybe on the exam. So I'll make this point actually right now. When you're calculating these out using the midpoint method, you might be like, well, wait, if I'm calculating percentage change in price, how am I getting decimal values? Right? Well, it really doesn't matter. If you're using the decimal form, you're just moving that decimal 2 places. So if I multiply both things by 100, the units cancel. It doesn't matter if I use probabilities or percentages. Now, when I'm calculating these out by hand, I'm going to get the decimal values when I use that midpoint method. On the exam, what you might see on some questions like this, and I'll show you one here in just a second, is I might tell you instead that the percentage change in price was 66.6, and the percentage change in quantity supplied was 55.5%. So I'm much more likely on the exam, I'll give you the percentages as opposed to kind of the decimal form of them. But when you're actually calculating, like calculating using the midpoint method, like we did in the previous one, you're going to have decimal values, right? It's just the percentage move the decimal point to place. So give me a little bit of time, come up with what that elasticity of supply is, determine the elasticity or inelasticity, and then who's going to bear more of the burden if a tax is imposed on this market. Can I talk to the people around you? Like I said, I'll give only a couple minutes here.
That 0.66, was that negative? That last one?
So you're right. You want to make these all negative, right? You're right. Sorry, I forgot there was a price decrease, not a price increase. So a price decrease could cause the quantity supplied to go down, right? Lower prices, supply. Thank you.
Well, they're negative. Or would you round them? Yeah. You have like. What? Like rounding? You want us to round it?
You can round to the second decimal. Like I said, usually I'll either round to the second or third decimal. Yeah.
I follow the same thing where like last thing is on inelastic right, or is it inverse? The opposite.
I don't know. So think about it. Yeah, if we were to think about. Doesn't really have a good interpretation for us. So the reason why we care about demand is because that's how much money. That's full revenue. The reverse would almost be like the amount of surplus in bracket for producing 550. But it would be, you could do that. I won't do it on the exam, but yes, you could, everything.
Wait.
Yep. Because that's a lot. Start out with really. Well, actually, it's a little bit more difficult to supply depending on the slope, because think about it as you're starting with both low values. So it would depend on how high up the supply. But as long as that supply is not zero, yeah. All right, hopefully this one's not too bad. So I think I still have arrangement, but we said that we can think about any elasticity. Our numerator is the responsiveness of something to whatever's changing in the denominator. If I'm thinking about supply, I'm thinking about the responsiveness of quantity supplied, and it's responding to a percentage change in price. Once again, numerator is what's responding, denominator is what's changing. Hopefully in the next couple examples, I'll give you some other ways to think about this too. So here, I've got what? Negative 66 point, actually, no, what did that tell you? Did I flip those? Yeah. Negative 55.5 from that negative 66.6 percentage change in price. It's as simple as that. On the exam, in fact, I think the first question on this practice problem set, I'm giving you even easier, like I'll give you probably easier numbers on the exam, even though what we're using here, right? I tell you the percentage change in both the price and quantity supplied. It should be as simple as kind of taking whatever's responding, dividing it by whatever's changing, okay?
I feel like the other numbers is what like like
right? So you have to take that negative, or you mean the 0.55? So sorry, that confused anyone. I was saying if you compute these by hand, like you had to using that midpoint method, you'll end up with the percentage changes in decimal form. So for instance, right, 50% is in decimal 1.5. But when it comes to questions on the exam, like you'll see here on these practice problems, I won't give it to you in decimal form. I'll make it a little bit, I think it's easier to kind of just deal with these percentages. So I can give you nice numbers like 10%, 15%. Okay, does that help clarify? So then I'll use those percentages to calculate my elasticity. This ends up being what? 5, 6, so 0.181.
0.83.
I don't know why I have that number. So supply would be what? Considered what? Yeah, it's not elastic. The only way it'd be elastic if it was greater than 1. 0.833 is less than 1. So we actually have inelastic supply and demand. Okay? The only way it's elastic is if it's greater than 1. Any questions on that? Any confusion that need clarified? Yeah.
Well, it's related more to the income and there were problems where like income increased, price decreased, and now like substitute stuff like that.
I've got a set of questions I'm gonna show you. Yep. So we've got that it's inelastic. The third question we have there. If there's a tax, who bears more of the burden? As kind of a reminder, we had that the elasticity of demand was negative 0.33 or the absolute value was 0.33. So who's going to bear more of the burden?
Would they both bear the same burden since they're both inelastic?
So this is why I made these numbers the way I did, right? To prove this point. Even if both of the consumers and producers are inelastic, the person who's going to bear more of the burden is the one who is more inelastic. So it could be, an easier example would be as if I did give you that supply was elastic and demand was inelastic, but that it doesn't matter what side they're on, it just matters who is more inelastic. So in this case, who's going to be more inelastic? Sorry, did I say more inelastic? Yeah. So whatever the lower value is. So we've got that consumers are more inelastic, and whoever is more inelastic, whoever is not responding as much to this tax change, they're going to bear more of the burden, right? So even if they're both inelastic, it's who is more inelastic. Okay. Does that make sense? Or any questions on that? Yeah.
One more time.
Yeah, so whoever is more inelastic, or if you want to think about it this way, if you're mathematically minded, whichever elasticity is closer to zero. Whichever elasticity is closer to zero, that's who's going to bear more of the burden. In this case, demand was closer to zero, or their inelasticity, right, was smaller here. So they're more inelastic. So that means that the consumers, right, consumers bear more of the burden. If instead we had an example, let's say I did the flip, you could actually have both of these be elastic. So let's say I have the elasticity of demand be 2.3, elasticity of supply be 1.2. Well, now I have a situation where both demand and supply are now elastic. So who's going to bear more of the burden? Well, who is more inelastic? Or who is closer to zero? Supply. So in that situation, we would say not supply, we would say producers kind of bear more of that burden because they're more inelastic, or their elasticity is closer to zero. Yep, if demand elasticity is closer to zero than supply, like we had over here, 0.33 is closer to 0.83, and consumers or more than burden.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. We think about demand as reflecting the marginal benefit of consumers. Supply was reflecting the marginal cost of producers. Yep. Yeah, so I've got two things I'm going to cover next about elasticity. So just before I move on, are there any questions kind of here that we want to clarify before we go to the next step? So for the sake of time, does everybody have this written down on the kind of raise this side of the board? Okay. So there's two other types of elasticities, and they tell us something about the goods, right? Which is the income elasticity and then cross price elasticity. So a good example of this, and we can kind of use these, you'll have these values here. A good example of what this might look like is I give you a cross price, or I give you the percentage change in the price of good X. I say as a result, the quantity demanded of this other good Y changed by this percent. I want you to calculate the cross price elasticity, and then based off of that, it should tell you whether or not there's substitutes or complements. When you think about why. So if we're looking for a cross price elasticity, once again, what's changing here? What was the original change? The price of good X. Right? So what's changing is what goes on that denominator, right? And then our numerator is what's responding to that change. The price of good X fell as a result, right? The responding thing here is quantity demanded. So we're thinking about the percentage change in quantity demanded, but of a different good, right? So what's changing and what's a result, or what's responding to that change? Questions there? These practice problems are pretty good examples of the kind of questions you can see in the exam. So I keep the numbers pretty easy, right? So we have what? The percentage change in quantity demanded good Y was 10%, over the percentage change in price, which was 20. So we get what? 0.5%. Let me make sure I did this. They're both increases, right? Yep. So they're both positive values. So be careful when you're reading these. Make sure you don't just look for those numbers. Make sure you know whether or not it's increasing or decreasing.
The price always goes at the top, and quantity demand always goes.
Yeah, the only other thing that we could see, now we'll kind of skip ahead a little bit here, but the only other elasticity that we talked about is the only other thing that we're thinking about changing other than the price of something is an income change. Right. So the only other elasticity that we thought about was if we see a change in income, what's the resulting response of quantity demand? That's the only other elasticity that we talked about. That one is the only example where we don't have price. Now, to point something out here, if both of these are moving in the same direction, so the price of good X goes up, and the quantity purchased of this other good Y also goes up. What must that mean if we see that this is positive about these two goods? So I'm hearing people say, so a good way to think about this is just pick two goods, right? So think about if the price, like if the price of something goes up and you see the quantity purchase of another good go up, what that must mean is, well, this other good is now more expensive. So what do people do? Buy less of that good and buy more of its substitutes. So when the price of a good goes up, people buy less of that, more of the substitutes, or more of this good Y. So when price moves in the same direction, our elasticity will be positive, right? Even if I had an example where I decrease the price of a good and that decreased the quantity of good Y, negative over negative, I'll still end up with this positive. Now, if I ever see a situation where price of good X goes up and the quantity demanded of good Y goes down, well, that must mean that I'm using these two things at the same time, so that increase in the price of the other goods, almost like I'm increasing the price of the other good that I need to use, right? Batteries and anything that requires batteries. And so anytime I see this elasticity measure be negative, that's where we said we kind of have complements. Okay. So if we end up with a positive cross price elasticity substitutes, negative cross price elasticity tells us they're complements. Any questions on that? You know, an easier way to remember that is probably to go back and think about the shifts in demand and think about the relationship of substitute goods, that as the price of one good goes up, for all of its substitutes, the demand would go up as well. Right? Because if I increase the price of, use your brand examples, if I increase the price of a 2 liter of Pepsi by $5, right? People stop buying that, they're gonna greatly increase the quantity they buy of Coke. Those are substitute goods, right? So I think the branding kind of idea there really kind of helps solidify the idea of substitutes. And then complements would be that if the price of something goes up and the quantity of these other goods goes down, well, I must be using those two things at the same time. So an increase in the price of the other goods is almost like an increase in the price of that other good.
Is this related to like the normal good and the period good?
So that's the next step down, right? So just like the sign of our cross price elasticity told us about whether or not they were substitutes or complements, if we think about the income elasticity, right? So let's say, I think I gave you some numbers here. So this is one where you could go through and actually calculate what it is. I kind of skipped the intermediate steps, because then based off of what that number is it elastic or inelastic? You could actually compute what the value is. So let's say, just for instance, I don't know. We'll use 20 and 15. We saw a 15% increase in income, and as a result, we saw a 15 or 20% increase in the quantity demand. So we can calculate the value of this and determine whether or not income elasticity is elastic or inelastic. But more likely, what I would ask you is, based off of what this value is, this is what, 4/3 or 1.33 repeating. Are these two goods, so we've got what, greater than 0? Are they normal or inferior? Well, if I increase income and people buy more of that good, that tells me that it's normal, right? That's just kind of how we think about most goods. If I have more money, I'm probably going to buy more of things, right? However, we had this weird situation where maybe, I don't know, let's say we saw that we see income go up and people actually buy less of a good, right? So we end up with a negative income elasticity. If I have more money and buy less of a good, we say that good would be inferior, right? This is the idea of, when I have more money, I buy less ramen or Keystone, right?
So, I know I'm probably jumping the gun a little bit, but if it's at 1.35, why would it be normal and not, luxury? It's over.
Luxury goods. Okay, so we didn't do anything with luxury goods. You don't have to worry about those. There's a definition of, it's actually would be the idea that you would need to have a high enough elasticity that you would be purchasing a lot more of the good, even from a small percent change in income, because once you get enough income, even large changes are very small percent changes. So don't worry about luxury goods. The only type of question I'd ask you about is whether or not goods were normal or inferior. Okay. Any other questions on this? Okay. Now I might ask you whether or not this is elastic and inelastic, kind of like I did here. I can't remember the exact value of elasticity for this specific problem. But here we would say income elasticity is elastic, right? 1.33 is greater than 1. Same kind of idea. When I'm dealing with cross price or income elasticities, I need to be thinking about the absolute value when I'm labeling it as inelastic or elastic. So here, right, I could have seen my elasticity is -3. Well, technically that's less than 1 because it's a negative value. But remember, when we actually go to put it in those ranges, the is it inelastic or elastic? Always think about the absolute value of your elasticity, right? That's how you determine it, whether or not it's elastic, unit elastic, or inelastic. Okay. Would be elastic, right? The absolute value is 3, but is greater than 1. You would say it's an elastic. This income is elastic, or the income elasticity here is elastic. Yeah. Excuse me. All right. Any other questions? So that really hammers a lot about elasticities. Told you there was going to be one thing that I went through today that could be on the exam. Might be on the exam for the sake of time. So I want you guys to do wellness. I will kind of hold off and talk about subsidies down the road. Okay? So when I said that you have to know one thing about subsidies, you don't have to know anything about subsidies for this exam. Okay. I think it ran a little bit of time. I guess the only thing that I was going to have you know is that basically any action by the government, we see deadweight loss. Right. So subsidies are the same thing. They just result in additional deadweight loss, just like taxes, price ceilings, and price floors. Okay. So let's think about if we had a short answer question like this, right? And I'm going to keep the exam strictly multiple choice. Actually, in a lot of ways, I think that will make it a little bit easier for you. So we'll be using partial credit. I've done different combinations of both. They end up being about the same. And actually, short answer, I think it makes the time more of an issue. It's just harder to kind of make sure that everything was neat and nice and I can read. So I might ask you different multiple choice questions, kind of similar to this. So let's say I give you a graph that looks like this. I'll ask you a couple different questions. So here it was consumer, producer, surplus, deadweight loss, and tax revenue. But here's another question I might ask. If I'm looking at this graph, what's the value of the tax here? Yeah, how do you know that? Right? The change in my supply curve was just due to whatever the value of that tax is. So if I was to look at any quantity, if I were to look at these two quantities, the difference in my supply curve and the supply curve plus the tax is just the value of the tax. And what ends up being nice here is once we identify the new equilibrium price consumers pay, we go down to that supply curve, that difference is just going to be the value of the tax, right? The difference between that supply curve and the supply curve of the tax. So here we have a $200 tax. Also, I think I have to scroll down because I don't know what that quantity is. So I need that. There we go. Okay. So right away, just intuitively, even if I don't want to match up the visual, what's the amount of tax revenue here? What's the new equilibrium quantity after this tax? So 6 units are sold, all right? After this tax, where does my supply curve plus the tax hit my demand curve? At that quantity of 6. Okay. At that quantity of 6, right? How much is every unit taxed? We already said $200. So 6 times 200. All right. Now, visually, that was this kind of rectangle, right? That was right here. But if I just think about what tax revenue is, it's the value of the tax times however many units were sold after the tax. Any questions on that?
What did you multiply?
Yeah, so I just took, how much, think about, what does government generate in tax revenue? Well, it's however many units are sold times however much tax I was getting from each unit. So I'll take the new equilibrium quantity, the number of units that are sold after the tax, and then multiply that by whatever the value of the tax is. Now, like I said, visually I can think about, we said this was the area of this rectangle, right? So 500 minus 300, well, that was the value of the tax, 200 times we're going from 0 to 6, so the base will be 6. What if I wanted consumer surplus here? So a non-technical way to remember this is consumer surplus is always on top, producer surplus is always on bottom. But the definition is, it's the difference between the marginal benefit to consumers and their marginal cost. Well, demand reflects their marginal benefit, right? Demand is this downward sloping curve, and label it here, but we know that's because it's downward sloping. So the difference between demand curve and their marginal cost is the new price that they'll pay. So it's kind of that upper triangle there. We would say 800 minus 500 is the height, times it goes from 6 to 0, so the base is 6, and then it's a triangle, so we multiply it by it. What if, let's say there's kind of, I'll get to this one. What if I then wanted deadweight loss? So what is deadweight loss? It's the loss of surplus from whatever this government act. So here we have a tax. Before, total surplus was this entire triangle. After the tax, we lose all the surplus on these units that we're no longer selling, right? The new quantity, the old equilibrium quantity is 8, the new quantity after the tax is 6. We lose that entire area of surplus, the area in between the demand and supply curve for all those units we're no longer selling. Or a non-technical way to remember this, it's kind of similar to pricing and price floors. It's this triangle to the right, right? Non-technical way to remember it, but that is what it's going to be. So we look at that triangle, the height of it. Now we could use the numbers here. What I said with these tax examples, the height of that triangle will always be the value of the tax. And then the difference in quantity is how many fewer units we sold. So 8 minus 6, right? The base of that triangle is 2. And then times 1/2 the triangle. But I could actually find through some surplus. I got a couple things I want to say before I let you guys get out of here. So I'm going to walk through that with you. In fact, I think I cheated here. This should be starting at 0, to be clear, so you can calculate from 0. Yeah.
I know the question is where you got 0, but I'm assuming you got 0 from the starting.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about, yep, goes from 0 to 6. If it's easier just to use 6, I can do that. Yeah.
The value that you tax was, how did you get to these? What?
It's just going to be, if you're looking at the same quantity, the difference between your supply curve and your supply curve plus the tax. So I've got the exam written, about 25 questions. Some of them I think will be fairly easy. So some of you should be able to move through really quickly. Like hopefully when I'm giving you these percentages and I'm just asking you for the elasticity of supply, hopefully that's an easy calculation. Or if I actually it's an elastic let, hopefully it's quick to kind of look at those ranges. Some of them will take a little bit longer. Time will probably be quite tough. So if you don't want to spend too much time on any one problem, I'll have that midpoint method written up. I'll probably write total revenue, price times quantity, a couple of the other basic equations that you would need. I'll bring blank paper. I would try to get you a little early, so if we can kind of get started a little bit early, give you a little bit more time. Although I don't think there's a class in here afterwards, so we might try to push this 10 minutes, so we have a whole hour. Any other questions for me before we got into that? Right, so I'll be in my office 2 to 4 today. I'll put an announcement on canvas. My office hours tomorrow will be 1:15 to 3:15. I have to change that. All right. All right. I'll see you guys on Friday for the exam.